Now let's talk about nailing your focus and your exposure. You really don't want to rely on just your eyes and the viewfinder or the screen itself. Let's first talk about focus. Believe it or not, most professional videographers don't use autofocus at all. It's just too unreliable. In the rare case that you're going to be filming something that requires a very quick or specific focus pull, you're either going to have to do it 100% manually, or you may have to rely on your camera's autofocusing. Now, most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras are not actually capable of keeping up with a shot like this, where I'm walking towards the camera. Our GH5 has notoriously bad continuous autofocus, and therefore we never use it. Some other cameras like our Sony a7R II actually has really impressive autofocus, and in some cases it actually can pull off a shot like this, and it looks like somebody is actually manually pulling this focus. Now, because we know that our GH5 isn't capable of pulling focus this smoothly, we simply wouldn't record video like this. Maybe we would shoot with a deeper depth of field so we wouldn't have to change focus at all, or maybe we would pre-focus and then we'd have the subject walk into focus. There are certainly ways to work around this so that we can work with the limitations of our camera. 99% of the time, we are pre-focusing on a subject and the distance from our camera to the subject is not moving at all throughout the entire take. For that reason, we can leave the camera completely in manual focus and we don't have to worry about pulling focus really ever. So even though the GH5 has terrible continuous autofocus while it's recording, before you actually hit record, the autofocus is extremely reliable. You'll find that to be the case with most other cameras as well. For that reason, before we record, we can simply move the autofocus point onto our subject's face, press the autofocus button, the camera autofocuses for us, and then once we hit record, we flip the camera back into manual focus. Now, autofocusing this way is accurate 95% of the time, but there's still a couple of things that you can do to make 100% sure that your shots are in focus. Now, the first thing you can do to check your focus is to zoom in or punch in. Right now, David is turning the manual focus knob on the front of our lens on the GH5, and that automatically punches in with that camera. On your camera, you may have to hit the plus button on the back of the camera or maybe hit the magnifying glass. This is going to zoom in and it's going to help you make sure that your focus is right where you want it to be. Another tool that some specialized video cameras have is focus peaking. As you can see right now, there are red lines around me, and this is showing us the areas of focus in the scene. This makes it very easy to see what you're focused on without actually having to zoom in. Now let's talk about nailing your exposure. The first tool that we're going to use is zebra stripes. You'll notice in the scene behind me here, and little specks in the sky and little bits on the ground, we can see these zebra stripes showing up where the exposure is pure white. This makes it very easy for us to figure out what is completely blown out. Now, having little bits of overexposed area in the background and my sky or maybe reflections on the ground isn't a big deal at all, but I definitely wouldn't want to see overexposed, pure white, blown out areas on my face. So even when we're outside right now and it may be very difficult to see the LCD, turning on zebra stripes makes it very easy and quick to check your exposure. Now let's talk about the histogram. If you're coming from a still photography background, you're probably pretty familiar with the histogram, but let's quickly go over it. So as you can see right here, we've turned on the histogram, and the histogram is basically a graphical representation of the amount of pixels and their lightness over the entire frame. On the left side of the histogram, you have pure blacks moving from black to white from left to right, and on the very right side we have pure white. You'll notice that most scenes have a bell-shaped curve, meaning that the majority of the pixels have a medium tone or lightness. If you're shooting a really dark scene, your histogram is going to be pushed really far to the left, and if you're shooting a really bright scene, it's going to be pushed really far to the right. Shooting a really dark scene or a really bright scene is totally fine, but the key here is that you don't want to blow out either pure blacks or pure whites. You want to have really dark darks but still retain detail in those shadows, and you want really bright brights without blowing them out and going into pure white. So keep an eye on the histogram as David lowers the exposure on this shot. You can see it's moving further down to the left, and now David, move up this exposure and you can see the histogram is moving over to the right. Now keep in mind that the histogram is showing us the basic exposure of the image overall, and that can be helpful, but it's not actually showing you which parts of the image might be over or underexposed. It's just giving you an overall reference. So now let's talk about the waveform. And many DSLRs are not going to give you this option at all, but some specialized video cameras will, and this can be a really valuable tool to make sure that you get that exposure right on the money every time. Let's go back to the computer and I'll show you in detail how the waveform works. Okay guys, let's quickly look at scopes and waveforms. The reason why I want to show you this in Premiere is that it's just a little bit easier to see in Premiere because I can make it much larger, whereas on the back of our cameras, everything's going to be really small. If you'd like to open this up on your own Premiere, you can go to Window and then down to Lumetri Scopes. That's what this giant thing is over here. And if you want to change it, you can right click on this and go to Presets. And there's a lot of different ways that you can view this information. I personally like the waveform RGB. Basically, the way that this works is very similar to a histogram. 100 is pure white, anything above 100 is pure white, and 0 is pure black. And then you read this from left to right. So the left side of this vector scope represents the left side of this scene, and the right side over here represents the right side of the scene. So you'll notice up here at 100, we have 3 main areas of blown out pure white. This area right here is representing this light and this light right here. It also may be representing this highlight that's on this bar. This blown out area here is representing the light directly behind our subject's head. And then on the right side of the frame over here, you'll notice that we have some blown out area as well, and I believe that is the highlight reflection on the wall. The reason why I like looking at this rather than a histogram is that a histogram will tell you some areas might be blown out, but they don't really show what areas of the scene are blown out. So this makes it really easy to understand. Let's go to another scene really quickly. All right, so here are some chicken wings, and this is footage that we filmed for the final lesson in this tutorial, so you'll be seeing it again in a little bit. So let's look at the way that this exposure is represented on this waveform on the left of our Premiere screen here. You'll notice, first of all, that we have a lot of blown out areas. But if we actually look at the scene that we're looking at here, you'll notice that there is a lot of pure white kind of sprinkled throughout this entire shot. Starting on the left side of this frame, you'll notice that we do have some blown out areas, but we do also have a lot of detail in the highlights. And that makes sense because the plate that these wings are sitting on is a white paper plate. Now, I can tell here because I'm in a dark room and I'm looking very closely at this what exactly is blown out. And I can tell we've got some blown out area here. This sauce is completely blown out, and then we've got a highlight here that's totally blown out. But for the most part, we do have detail in the rest of this white plate. Now, you might argue that this is a little bit overexposed, but this is still pretty close in my opinion. I don't mind if white things are a little bit blown out. Now, as we move over on this waveform here, you'll notice that we still have blown highlights throughout the middle and the right side of this frame, and that's because we have these highlights reflecting in these chicken wings. But then if you look directly under these highlights, we don't have that much data here. And that's because the chicken wings overall are much darker. So we have most of the data down here in the midtones and shadow area. That's because we have dark chicken wings. But then we have very bright reflective areas where the sauce is glistening our lights back into the camera. And so we have these pure white blown out highlights that you can see as well that are being reflected up here. Now, on the bottom of the scope here, you'll also notice that we have some pure black shadows as well. But if we look at the actual scene that we're filming here, the pure black areas are really deep underneath all of these chicken wings. And again, there's absolutely no way you're not going to crush those. And I don't think that means that we have an incorrect exposure for this particular shot. I would say if anything, we might want to underexpose this a little bit more just to save those highlights, but for the most part, I would say this is a correct exposure. And if I was having a hard time seeing this because I was in bright light, or maybe I was looking at a really small LCD screen, being able to see the waveform like this would be a huge help and would guarantee me that I was actually getting the correct exposure. So now you should be very comfortable locking in that perfect focus and exposure. So let's move on to the next chapter.